Okay, good afternoon, fellow HMANA followers. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Josh Haas with the Hawk Migration Association of North America. I'm also joined by our staff member, Julie Brown, who many of you, if not all of you, already know very well. And we're really excited to have Dr. Dave Oleyar from Hawkwatch International with us today. Before we get too deep into the discussion today, I do just want to give some expectations for what's going to happen. As many of you know, we record these sessions, so please keep that in mind. Your chats will be recorded as part of that, so please keep things civil. Also, keep in mind that we aren't allowing you to unmute yourself. That is by design. And so what we'd like you to do is please go to the bottom of your Zoom tool and open up that chat screen and make sure to chat with us. Tell us where you're from, just say hi, and use this to ask your questions that you want asked of Dr. Dave. What will happen at the end of his presentation, Julie Brown will facilitate asking those questions that have been asked in the chat to Dave, and he'll have some good question and answer time. We'll make sure that there's enough time for that. And then at the end, we'll close things out like we normally do and look ahead to next month. In terms of Zoom expectations, I already mentioned about muting and not having the ability to unmute yourself. Again, you can chat. If you are unhappy with the way your view looks, make sure you go to the little view button at the top right-hand side of your Zoom window. And there are a few options to choose from, like speaker view, gallery view, things like that. Which will let you customize the view how you'd like it. Also, if you do see a view of the shared presentation as well as video profiles for some of the users on the right-hand side, there's a little button kind of thing in the middle there with two lines. If you hover over that, you can make the profile window smaller and the presentation bigger if you'd like. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie Brown, who will introduce Dave. Go ahead, Julie.
Great. Thanks, Josh. Thanks for joining us today, everyone. I see a lot of RPI sites popping up on the screen. I'm glad you could join us. I am excited to be featuring RPI today and just what we've been learning about raptor trends from the decades and decades of data. Over 40,000 hours of migration monitoring in the Hawk Count database. It's exciting, and HMANA is excited to be a part of this. Dr. Dave Oleyar is the Director of Long-Term Monitoring and Community Science at Hawkwatch International, where he leads research programs on raptor migration, American kestrel conservation, urban raptor ecology, and forest owl ecology. Dave holds an undergraduate in biology from Baylor University in Texas, where he first started working with cavity adopted species while helping with Dr. Fred Gelbach's long-term work on rural and suburban eastern screech owls. He earned his MS in raptor biology from Boise State University, where he studied the impacts of ski area development associated with the 2002 Winter Olympics of flammulated owls nesting in northern Utah. Dave's doctorate at the University of Washington focused on urbanization impacts on songbird populations and communities. Serving on the RPI steering committee since joining Hawkwatch International in 2014, Dave is excited to share the most recent findings from this partnership between HMANA, Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, Birds Canada, and Hawkwatch International. So thank you, Dave, for joining us today and giving us an update on RPI.
Hi, thanks, Julie. Thanks for having me, and it's exciting to talk about the work that we've been doing. I assume most of the audience, if not all, are tied to a Hawkwatch site somewhere. I've seen them all chiming in, and a good number of those Hawkwatch sites are sites that are in this current RPI update. So it's great to see that, and hopefully you appreciate and like what we're finding out from including data from your sites and sites across the continent. So RPI kind of was born in the early 2000s and came out and was first introduced with the State of North America's Birds of Prey, which was a volume that focused on raptor conservation status, migration trends, and information needs for North American raptors, and included data from 22 count sites that ran through 2004. RPI has put out updates since then. Right now we do that every 3 years, and we keep adding sites to the mix. There's a couple of different thresholds of effort and time that you run for sites to be included in the RPI index. So essentially 10 years of data in a standard season with a standard daily effort is essentially kind of what gets a site added to the list of RPI sites that we include in these kinds of analyses. So you probably have seen this map, or at least portions of this map, when you're looking for like your local Hawkwatch site or the Hawkwatch site where you might be visiting in the spring or the fall. Here is a map of watch sites that submit their data to hawkcount.org, which HMANA runs. And so these are all of the places where people monitor either in the fall or the spring and put in their daily and hourly count data and how much time they spend counting, and have done that over the years. The white diamonds that you see there represent the watch sites that are in the 2019 RPI update. And so I will go here, and these are those sites shown again. So we have 76 sites. So that's up from 22 when this effort was first introduced. 76 sites that have at least 10 years of count data. 3 of those sites are dual sites, which means that they count in the spring and in the fall. So for these trends and updates for what different species are doing, there's a total of possible 79 trends for a species. For instance, if it was something that was counted at every site and every season in the data included in these analyses that I'll be talking about. So in all, for the 10-year span, so recent data, which is what I'll really focus on today, between 2009 and 2019, that's 998 trends for diurnal species that are counted at Hawkwatch sites that we have data on and are pulling together to synthesize and hopefully tell a meaningful conservation story, right? And so that is impressive. And like Julie said, that's over 40,000 hours of effort and over 9 million migrants counted. Of course, there's some repeats because sites are in flyways, but it's a monumental effort, and we couldn't do it without all of the volunteer counters and professional counters and organizations that run all of these different sites. So thank you. Let's talk about how we do this. So the analysis for RPI is essentially twofold kind of steps. We take a given year at a watch site and turn those counts into an annual index, which basically summarizes birds per day, if you want to think about it that way. And then we use those indices to look for trends and whether those are going up or down. And if you want the nuts and bolts of how that's done, it's here, but you can go to rpiproject.org and there's detailed information on exactly what we do. But for a given species, like peregrine falcon here at the Corpus Christi Hawkwatch, these little dots represent the annual RPI index value. And then the line and the information up here is essentially the trend that we fit to those using Bayesian methods and look to see whether or not there's a supported increase or decrease at a site. Or if there's not, then we interpret that as meaning that the count over that time period is stable. So we don't see any change in what's going on. So that's for a single site. And for species that are counted at all of those sites, you can imagine a plot of what's going on for all of up to, potentially 79 different plots right here of what's going on with peregrine falcons, right? And so that gets a little overwhelming when you're trying to look at all of these trend plots, but we summarize these trend plots, and that's what we're going to spend some time today doing. So not thinking about what kind of species we're talking about, over the last 10 years, 2009 to 2019, like I said, we had 998 trends for different raptors that we looked at. Just breaking down into what the patterns of those trends were, that's what these little pie charts show you. So for North America, using all of those 998 trends that we looked at, 68% of those were stable. So they didn't have, they didn't support increases or decreasing counts over time. So stable for the most part, which is good news. The red that you see there shows the declining number of trends. So we had 215 declines out of those 998 trends, right? So that's 22%. And then we had 10% of these counts, 105, showed increasing trends for different species. And then what these other pie charts right here just show you is these same trends broken down by region. So in the West, there's 118 trends that were estimated. 11 of those, or 9%, showed decline, right? To the east, to the Gulf, and or to the Gulf, Central, Gulf, and the east. And you can see that there's a whole lot of count sites in the east region. If you live in the Northeast, you are you have to decide which count site to go to, not if there's one near you, which is kind of a nice problem to have. So this is the last 10 years. We also look at this on different time spans. So if you look and you go and you look at sites that have at least 20 years of data with a standard effort, this is what you look like. And so we get 504 trends that are estimated. And over the last 20 years, roughly half of those trends are stable, 30% of those are declining, and 20% of those are increasing across North America. And you can see the breakdown here. And what hopefully might jump out at you as you look at these is that you start to see some regional patterns where there's a lot of stability in the West. And you tend to see the central region and the east region have far more declines. And part of that is an artifact of having more sites, but part of that is we think, at least for some species, there's actual declines going on in the central and eastern parts of North America. And then there's even fewer sites that have been around for 30 years, but of those, there's 214 trends. And so this is one way to break down this huge data set and all of these trends and think about what can we glean about raptor populations. This next slide I'm going to show you is just focusing in on the 10-year decline. So these 215 declining trends across North America for the last decade. Who are those species, right? So this is just a pie chart showing which species make up the declining species across North America. And so our number one largest proportion of those declines were sharp-shinned hawks, with 17%. Of the declines, of all of the declines across North America, are sharp-shinned hawks, are sites with sharp-shinned hawks. You can see that red-tailed hawks are there, northern harriers too. And so this is just one way of looking and seeing which species are declining across the continent. We can also look to see which species are declining across the West. And it's a slightly different story. You can see sharp-shinned hawks and kestrels are the two big decliners in the West. We can look at the central region. Red-tailed hawks and rough-legged hawks tend to be the larger pieces of the pie there. The Gulf region, we only have 3 species, and there's only 3 sites with declining trends. So one site has declining swallow-tailed kites, declining Mississippi kites, and declining osprey. And then here's the east again with many more sites, so many more trends. And again, kind of the same pattern in the east as we see for most of North America is sharp-shinned hawks, red-tailed hawks, and northern harriers are kind of the species that make up the biggest proportions of those declines in the last 10 years. So we take that and we summarize all of that, and basically this table just summarizes that pie chart ranked by percent decline. So for the last 10 years, here's our top 8 declining species. So sharp-shinned hawks, northern goshawk, rough-legged hawk, red-tailed hawk, northern harrier, osprey, Cooper's hawk, and American kestrels, right? And here's the total number of sites. Here's the number of declining trends across North America for that. And then this table also shows the 20 years. So we often, we want to broaden out the picture and see longer term, are the same species declining or do we get a shift? And if you look at the 20-year data, rough-legged hawks were the top decliner. Goshawks are number 2 still. American kestrels bump up and are a little bit higher. Red-tailed hawks are still on the list at number 4. It's basically the same species. The order is a little bit different, right? So these are the species where we see the most migration declines. So pie charts and tables are helpful, but it's also helpful to kind of think about geography when you look at where count sites are and where we start to see declines. And so I'm going to take more time on this first example than I will on the rest of the species that I'm going to talk about. But what we have here is just a map of those 2009 to 2019 trends for red-tailed hawks, right? And so the symbols on the maps are the count sites where we have those trends estimated for this species. The down arrows are supported declines, sites with declining counts over that 10 years. The up arrow, there's just one, is a site where we see increasing counts of red-tailed hawks over that time span. And all the little blue dots are sites where the counts are pretty much the same. So they indicate stable counts of red-tailed hawks on migration. And so hopefully, there's a whole lot of symbols on up in the Northeast, like we've talked about, but there's also a whole lot of red declines right there. So we're seeing fewer red-tailed hawks on migration in the Northeast compared to, say, the West, where there's the site up in Washington where you see declines, but most of the rest of those sites in the West are stable or increasing. So that's the story on migration. One of the things that is valuable, and another nice example of community science project where there's long-term data on counts of bird species, is the Christmas bird count. And so if we look at Christmas bird count data that is lumped by state and province, so this is using analysis and data from me and et al.'s analysis that's cited down there at the bottom of the map. But what we have here are winter trends. So these are winter trends for red-tailed hawk by state. The green states are places where we see increasing winter numbers for red-tailed hawks, right? The light gray are places where red-tailed hawk counts during red-tailed hawks on Christmas bird counts are stable. And then the reddish pink provinces and states are areas where we see declining counts in the winter for red-tailed hawks, right? So that tells another picture. And so we look at both migration trends and winter trends because hopefully that can tell us a little bit more about what we might be seeing with migration trends than just migration trends alone. So if we pop those two things together, here is migration data and winter data overlaid together. And so what you see here is we want to look and see where we see declining migration counts. Do we also see declining winter counts or stable winter counts or increasing winter counts? Because that tells kind of different stories about population trajectories, if you want to think about it that way. And so you can see over the last 10 years, while we have a whole lot of declining migration counts for red-tailed hawks, in these same areas where the count sites are, or when you look north, right, because that's where the migrants would be coming from, we see stable, we see some increasing winter populations up in the far Northeast. We see declining numbers of red-tailed hawks counted on winter in Ontario. And so, this area paired with this might indicate actual declines of red-tailed hawk populations in these areas. Whereas if we're looking down here and sort of a little bit further south, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey area, these declining trends might be because the birds up in Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont aren't migrating, right? So because there's increasing numbers there. And so that starts to give us a little more resolution into our migration trends that we see when we consider winter data too. And so the next slide just throws on those pie charts about what's going on with red-tailed hawks in the different regions, but also North America as a whole, right? And this is migration data summarized. So 41% of migration counts over the last 10 years for red-tailed hawks have been declining counts. So we'll look at some other species. And so now, these next few slides are for some of those declining species on that list, and it's species that everything's together. So we're not going to walk through each layer, but it's all together. So here's the last 10 years trends for sharp-shinned hawks. And hopefully what jumps out at you is that half of the migration sites, half of those symbols on the map, almost 48% of them are declining counts over the last 10 years, right? So we're seeing fewer sharp-shinned hawks migrating in this most recent 10 years. And then look and see what's going on with winter counts underneath of that. And at least in the East, where we've got 55% of the counts in the East are declines, we have a whole lot of winter declines too, really, in some of these states. And so that might indicate actual real population declines of sharp-shinned hawks in the most recent decade, right? And we look and we jump over to the West, and you can see that there's only 33% decline. So 3 sites in the West show sharp-shinned hawk declining. There's the rest are stable. And then when you look and see what's going on with lunar populations, we've got a whole lot of gray. So stable winter populations or growing winter populations for sharp-shinned hawks in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and South Dakota, right? So that picture together, declining migration counts and increasing winter counts, that might suggest essentially that we've got portions of populations and birds that are either not migrating quite as far, so short stopping, or are choosing not to migrate at all, right? And so that this picture is less worrisome than this picture over in the east. So let's look a little bit further back for sharp-shinned hawks, just because that's an interesting story. So this is data, 20 years of migration trends. So 1999 to 2019, that's what these symbols show here. And then the Christmas bird count data is for 26 years. So it's from 1993 to 2019, okay? And so hopefully what you notice is there's a little bit of difference between what's going on in these two maps, right? We still have 51% of declines for the last 20 years for sharp-shinned hawks. We've got a lot of green, so a lot of increasing winter populations of sharp-shinned hawks in the west and in central part of North America. But then we've either got stable or a lot of declining winter counts paired with declining migration counts in the east. So again, this suggests that we're seeing actual population declines of sharp-shinned hawks potentially in the east. And so this just pairs both of these side by side. So here is on the right 10-year, and here's 20-year trends, right? And you can see there's definitely been a shift in what's going on both in winter and on migration for this species. Whoop. My mouse is being sensitive today, sorry about that. Here's results for northern goshawk. So in the winter, we can see mostly stable counts of northern goshawks with some decreases in Ontario, but 46% of counts that count enough northern goshawks to be included are declining across the country. 70% in the east, 14% in the west, right? So we've kind of got two different stories between the western part of North America and the eastern part of North America for this species too. Here's northern harrier, 90%. So we've got 39% of North America and count sites in fall and spring are seeing declines of northern harriers. 97% of those declines are all in the eastern part of the country. And then if you look at winter data, mostly stable across North America, some increases in the middle, but only declines in Texas, Louisiana, Florida, again, Ontario. So that's what we see from migration and winter data for northern harriers. Here's the American kestrel. So kestrels are a species that there's been a lot of work that shows that they've been in decline. Here's some migration and winter data to sort of back that up as well. So over the last 10 years, actually the story is not that bad for the last 10 years for kestrels. We've got 74% of sites, migration sites, have stable counts. Where we do have those declines, again, there's quite a few declines in the east. The two sites with increases are also in the east. And we see stable and increasing populations mostly in winter with some declines in California and then down in the southeastern part of the country. So I'm going to pair that with, here's the 20-year data for this species too, and 26-year winter data, right? So if we look over the last 20 years or so, that's a much different picture. I'm going to go ahead and put those both together right here. Look at all the red if we look back 20 years. So kestrels have definitely declined over the last 20 years, both on migration and in the winter. What we end up seeing though is that there's, again, and the pattern's most distinct if we look at this upper left graphic, huge winter declines. Almost all of the eastern part of North America has declining kestrel counts in winter over that time span. Almost all of the migration counts also are declining in that same time. We see declines in the west over this time period too, quite large, most of the sites. But notice that at the same time we see those declines, we see almost all of the northwest and inland Rocky Mountain area, we have increasing winter populations. So again, we see a story of actual, real declines in the east and the central portions of North America, and potentially just shifting migratory patterns and proportions of populations in the West. So again, that's what you can kind of start to tease out if you include two different types of data. So those were the declining species. We also find, we also see good news when we look at the RPI analyses and look for some species. And so which species are increasing? 56% of the sites where we count bald eagles, or sites that count bald eagles, show increases. Turkey vultures are on the increase. Prairie falcon was also the top, one of the top increasing species. That's by percentage, and note that's only 4 sites. So that could be a little misleading. That's one of those species that migration counts don't pick up all that well, because most counts are ridge sites, mountaintops, and we think a lot of prairie falcons probably use other areas for migration. But there's good news, which is nice. This is the same thing over the last 20 years. Bald eagles top the list again. Turkey vultures, Mississippi kites, peregrine falcons, and black vultures are increasing species on migration. Here's a nice map. That map looks a lot better than that Kestrel map for 20 years, doesn't it? We've got increasing winter populations, increasing migration counts for bald eagles pretty much across North America. It's one of those conservation success stories, and it's one of those nice things that efforts like this, these monitoring sites, actually document what conservation efforts work and which don't, right? To pick up that signal of success, you've got to be counting and surveying these things. Here's turkey vulture, same kind of story. Don't count. Turkey vultures are gone from the middle part of the continent in the winter, so you don't see any Christmas bird count data in that area. But where we do have wintering turkey vultures, they're mostly increasing or stable, and we see increasing or stable for the most part at migration sites too over the last 10 years. So that's just some examples. I don't want to take, not going to go through every single species. But one of the challenging things for us as the RPI team to do is to kind of synthesize and pull all of those trends from different sites and different species together and tell, a meaningful story and kind of highlight where we should be paying attention in terms of other conservation research and work. And so this trend summary index is basically a way to synthesize all of these trend results from multiple sites into a single value. So out of all of those 76 or 79 of their spring fall count sites, basically for a given species, if there's a trend for that species and it's declining at a site, it's scored as a -1. If it's increasing, it's scored as a +1. And if it's stable, it's scored as a 0. So we take all of those, we average that, and that's the summary index value for a species at a given time period and season, right? And we're talking about combined seasons here. So we did that for all of the RPI sites and species, and this is the ultimate result here, right? So that migration trend summary index value is here, and it's plotted for each species. And so 0 is stable up here, 1 is increasing overall for all the sites where a species is counted, and down here is the negative trend summary index, so that indicates overall decline, right? And so then these are ordered by those values from our most declining species at all of those sites up to our most increasing species, and that's kind of what you see here. And what jumps out, sort of the same story as with the table, is to begin the talk today, is that northern goshawks and sharp-shinned hawks are our most declining species in the last 10 years on migration. They have the same trend summary index value. They're followed by rough-legged hawk, red-tailed hawk, northern harrier, and then we get a jump, right? And so Cooper's hawks are declining, osprey are declining, kestrels are declining, but not nearly to the same extent as these 5 species here. And then you jump up here, and again, you see bald eagles, one of our most positive species, and here's some of the rest. The symbols that you see that are lighter gray are species that are not counted at a whole lot of different sites. So that means that this trend summary index is summarizing either between 1 to 5 sites. So that just means that value should be taken with a little bit of a grain of salt, at least knowing that that's one of the limitations of that score for that particular species. Okay, so that's the story on migration. We can actually do the same thing for winter. So this is the trend summary index in winter based on Christmas bird count summary data, right? And again, same idea, ranked. And so in winter, here are our top declining species. And you notice a lot of them are actually, these first two are migrants that disappear. Of concern is the rough-legged hawk, which actually is, shows up in a lot of portions of the lower part of North America in the winter. We've got declining counts there. We've got declining kestrel counts over the last 10 years. A lot of sort of stable near zero species, and then a whole lot of species with increasing counts in the winter over the last 10 years. Again, that supports the whole idea that we're seeing this shift in the proportion of individuals in different populations that are migrating at all, or potentially just migrating different, less far, right? And so that's kind of one way to think about these scores. And then what we can do is ultimately take these together. And if we plot these together, so this x-axis is the migration trend summary index that you just saw. This y-axis up and down is winter trends. So up in this upper left corner, right, species that would fall into this category have declining migration counts, but increasing winter counts. So that could suggest essentially that they're becoming less migratory, that they're short stopping, that their distributions are shifting, right? If we go to this quadrant over here, increasing migration counts, increasing winter counts, that's a success story. That indicates growing populations, growing distributions, right? Increase on migration, but decrease in winter might mean the species is becoming more migratory. Also got a shifting distribution. Maybe that distribution is shrinking in some cases, right? And then over in this lower left portion, this is where we've got decreasing migration counts and decreasing winter counts too. And those are those areas, those are those raptors at risk to me, right? Those are the species that we should be paying a special attention to, right? So that's kind of where these different zones in this plot, thinking about the story that they tell when a species falls in there, right? So now I'm going to pop up the actual values for the species over the last 10 years, right? And so here we've got Cooper's hawks, red-shouldered hawks, red-tailed hawks, osprey, all kind of falling into this becoming less migratory, short-stopping zone, right? Our conservation success and growing populations, bald eagles, turkey vultures, black vultures, right? And then down here are the species that we should be concerned about. It's not extremely far down. Like if you're way here, this means, big time danger zone. Here is closer to stable, but overall, declining migration and declining winter. So we've got kestrels, sharp-shinned hawks, rough-legged hawks, and northern goshawks, right? And so that's another way to kind of view and condense all of the information that comes from all of the count sites that submit their data to Hawk Count over the years, to kind of get a pulse on what's going on with diurnal raptors. And so this is kind of the current story that we're telling about that. So here's again the map of the 10-year sites included in the 10-year analyses, right? The nice thing about this effort is that it grows. We, each time we do the analysis, I know everyone on the team is excited to see which new sites pop up, right? And we're really hoping to get sites here. You might notice that there's not many dots in the central part of North America. But we update every 3 years. We get new sites that hit that 10-year mark of standard effort, standard season, and jump into the pool of RPI analysis. New sites in those areas where we don't have a lot of sites would be great. This story that these data tell, it doesn't end, right? Every time it's slightly different, and that's the whole point. We want to be able to document those successes and those species that might be declining during a certain time period. We won't know that decline's either slowed or stopped or reversed if we don't keep monitoring, right? And so that's important. And then last but not least, got to thank again anyone that's counted at a site over the 20, 30, 40 years, supported the site, supported a counter, had a partner, or spent any time or taking cookies or whatnot to watch sites, or gone and run a Christmas bird count survey in the winter. Those efforts are not only fun to do because it's just cool to spend a day looking for birds and raptors in general, right? But they are useful for assessing what's going on at larger scales. And so RPI and other efforts like Christmas bird count couldn't do that without all of you. So thanks for your attention. Hopefully you learned something interesting. Here again are the RPI partners. If you are inclined to do so, please consider supporting RPI's efforts by supporting a partner. You can actually make a donation directly to RPI on the HMANA website, right, Julie? Thank you for your attention, and we can answer questions if there are any.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dave. That was wonderful. That was a great snapshot of what RPI is doing and species we're concerned about and species that are rebounding a bit. It's nice to see so many new graphics that the RPI team has come up with, and different ways of looking at the data. I think when things first started, it was just kind of trend graphs. And now I love that we have pie charts and all these different graphics for making it, easier for people to interpret. And it's absolutely, your talk really stresses just the importance of migration monitoring, and it's given us the ability to really see what's happening over the long term, which is so important. Like Dave said, you can support the RPI project through the HMANA website, and that goes to support the whole partnership, and you can do that at HMANA.org. I can jump into a few questions if you want to answer a few, Dave.
I'll try. Yeah.
And if you have questions as we're chatting, just throw them into the chat and I'll try to get to them. Our first question is from Mike. He says, have you seen any westward shifts in migrating birds from banding data, like i.e. avoiding population increases in the east?
That's a good question. RPI efforts really focus on counts for the most part. So these data and this attention is focused on that. From Western banding efforts that I know about, and maybe someone is tuned in the audience in the East that can chime in too. Our banding efforts yield a pretty low return, right? In terms of there's a very small percentage of those birds that we ban that we ever get a reported, recapture or get a report back. And so it's a small sample to pull from to answer that kind of a question in terms of whether birds are shifting. I can't say that we get recaptures from, for instance, the Pacific flyway sites that Hawkwatch International runs. Most of those recaptures fall in the Pacific flyway too. Same thing with the Intermountain Rocky Mountain Flyway, but we do get jumps. So we get birds that we've banded in the West that show up in the Northeast, for instance, Cooper's hawks, and so there's no clear pattern that would suggest that avoiding high development, high population areas like you're asking about. It would be interesting to look into more, and I think with tracking technology. And the MODIS network, particularly in the East, which is little towers that pick up birds that have markers on it, we'll be able to answer those questions a lot better going forward than we are able to right now.
Absolutely. Exciting technology. Okay, Scott is wondering, he says, we have weather patterns like polar vortexes and hurricanes up in these areas. I think he's referring to the areas of decline, like the Northeast. Do these affect the bird numbers?
I think they do for a given site, right? So if you've got bad weather for a prolonged proportion of the migration season in an area, it would certainly make sense that migrants might shift around or over those types of things. It's the nice thing if you're a bird, you've got a lot of mobility and options in a lot of cases. That's again one of those detailed questions that RPI is not geared to answer. We are working and talking about including some weather events into the analyses when we've looked at those in the past, when past teams have looked at those. Weather has come out as not being incredibly added value to looking at the trends in migration, right? Not to say that it certainly matters, but I don't think that we haven't looked at it at that level yet. And I think if you were to see those shifts because of a polar vortex, you ought to see those, sites on either side of that ought to have a spike, and we've not picked up that signal yet either. So, that we're looking at a whole season across the years versus, single season weather events. But with those patterns becoming more and more prevalent, that'll be another important consideration and thing to think about how to look into going forward for sure.
Okay. Next question for you comes from Phil, also my husband.
Hi, Phil.
And this is an important question for a lot of sites. Our site in particular, we run a Hawkwatch site in New Hampshire, and we're thinking about extending our season. So Phil's asking, how does RPI account for a change in sites' methodologies, such as an extended season in more recent years, in which these sites may record higher numbers of later trending migrants?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Probably Julie, you might be better, just equally suited to answer that question. But we, before every analysis, we look to see which sites have the right number of years first and foremost. But then we also look at each year's effort, and basically the analysis. We can set masks, and essentially we can not include that added portion of the season in the analysis if it makes sense to do so, right? So we definitely do take a look, not only like extending the season, making it earlier or longer, but there's a lot of sites where, when a site just gets going, it's kind of a pilot effort, and sometimes it's piecemeal, right? And so like the hours of observation within a whole season is not always that long. Those are important data points, and it takes a while to get a site going with the local support and the people power to staff it for an extended season, right? And so we look at that too. And if we see variation either in daily effort or in the start or the end or the season length, those things get flagged for each site, and then the RPI team looks at it individually and decides how to address how to deal with it, right? Do we cut this site off at year X or Y, or include all of it? And those are discussions that happen each time we do a new analysis.
Great. Thanks. Okay. The next question is coming from Jennifer. This is definitely a question that comes up a lot with the RPI team. We were just talking about it at our recent meeting. Are flyways still a useful term to describe the patterns and pathways in migration?
It's a really good question. I think for some species, yes. And for some species, potentially no. To break up the continent into meaningful pieces, like flyways are a useful tool, and banding recoveries for a lot of different species, including raptors, are how those flyways have been defined in a lot of cases. But again, the more tracking we do with satellite technology and the more banding recoveries we get, we certainly see that those flyways aren't locked in, and so they're a tool. I would say that they're still useful. There are other units of space that you can consider what's going on at. So like bird conservation regions are one way, management regions for either Fish and Wildlife Service or states or other things, other entities are another way. And yeah, the RPI team, we have on our list all of these ways that we'd like to look at all of these data, and we're working towards those. The kind of regions and flyways is one of the first breakouts or breakdowns that we've done. Mm-hmm. I mean, the stark difference between east and west for a lot of these species is you can't ignore that. There's certainly something going on there.
Right. Okay, Clint is asking if a species is decreasing in migration count and CBC, but it is typically a more northern forest bird, such as a sharpshin or a goshawk, could it be also an issue of just shifting from a migratory behavior due to climate, but not being detected on CBCs due to remote habitat?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, CBC circles tend to be near settled areas, so there's sampling bias. Same thing with migration sites. So a declining a dual decline in winter and migration can mean a lot of different things, right? Not only that populations may really be declining, but distribution shifts, and those distribution shifts come with different biases in detectability and ability to count too. So yeah, that's certainly another explanation for the species that would fall in that lower left quadrant of declining on winter and declining on migration.
Eric is asking, in order to have its data included in the RPI, does a reporting site have to include hourly breakdowns of its data? If so, how is the hourly breakdown data used in the RPI? I know in, just this last analysis, we started including daily sites, that the ability to analyze sites that collect just daily data, but you can comment more on that, Dave.
Sure. These are great questions. This is a question that each analysis, the team, and each time we get a new team member, I think this discussion takes place. Currently daily data for a site for a year are lumped, or hourly data are lumped to daily totals, and those are what are used for the analyses. We've in the past asked that sites include those hourly data and breakdown. But in looking at the trends and like what it actually tells us, a former member of the team at Birds Canada, Tara Crew, did an analysis and has a paper that basically shows that there's not a big difference in terms of your trend estimates if you take the only hourly data only approach versus lumping to daily data. And so now we lump to daily data.
Okay. Andrea is we have a few more questions coming in. These are great questions, by the way. Andrea is wondering, is there not enough consistent data to include trends from the Alaska site? I think she's referring to Gunsight. Yeah. Yeah, so Gunsight is doesn't have a continuous 10 years of effort, and it doesn't have a continuous 10 years with a standard effort. We'll be doing the 5th full season count at Gunsight this upcoming spring. And so it'll eventually show up with luck. It'll be great to have a site that far up and included, but right now it doesn't have the effort or the length of years to be included. Yeah, we're excited to include it when we can. We do have a nice Golden Eagle site from Alberta that we'll be including on the next analysis, which we're really excited about. Okay, Sue is wondering, I'm wondering if the concept of availability is baked into the RPI in any way. Our site's numbers are very weather dependent. They are, yeah, so it's kind of, again, one of those weather questions, and past efforts that have looked to see how weather influences the overall variation in counts across a season, across years, has shown that, at least at the time that it was done, that it didn't add a lot to what we did. So we don't include that. For a site that has highly variable counts, that certainly could play into the trend that we estimate for that given site, right? So if it's just variable, maybe it's a stable site. Yeah, so I think the question was about availability or like birds being able to be counted. Yeah, we do our best to account for that. That's certainly a source of variation. One of the things that we do look at is if a given year has an outlier in terms of either really, really high effort or really, really low effort, we take a closer look at that and sometimes exclude those data. Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Questions are still rolling in. If you're good with answering a few more, Dave. Sure. Okay. I can't say that I'll answer them well, but I'll try. Okay. Clint is asking, what suggestions for the Great Plains for migration counting? Is there any potential? I'm curious if the Mescalero and Caprock escarpments in Texas or New Mexico areas have potential. Yeah, I think we've got a lot of count sites in the Northeast and kind of down the Appalachians because they're ridge sites and people like to go to ridge sites. I think we see this sort of the same thing in the West where there's a lot of ridge sites.
we've recently partnered with account site Cutbank Hawkwatch in Montana. That's out on the valley kind of slope area west of Glacier, and they see ridiculous numbers of rough-legged hawks and prairie falcons. And then it's not that exciting ridge site, but I think there's some of those escarpments in the central portion, Great Plains, where they would bear some pilot efforts to see if the counts are good. And then again, it's even if they're not phenomenal counts, like finding a site that you feel like gives you a good representation of migration through that area and sticking to it with getting up to a standard effort and keeping that effort going for those 10 years at least, those are the challenges and the things that I tell anyone that's asking about getting a new site up and going quickly is, anything you can do, it is great. To become most impactful as quick as you can, if you can have a pretty extensive season with an extensive effort and keep that going right from the get-go, then you add to this effort a lot more quickly.
Okay, I'm going to just jump in and say there's a few more questions coming in that I think we can get to, but I just wanted to remind people, if they're interested in getting HMANA's e-newsletter, you can enter your email address and we can send you our monthly e-news with just events like this Lunch and Learn, or upcoming tours and grants for Hawkwatch sites and things like that. So just add your email address if you're not already getting it. Dave Brandis, who's also on our RPI team, just said, just to add to what Dave said about daily versus hourly, it's still very useful for us to have hourly data so that we can assess consistency of coverage over time. That's absolutely true. We always encourage sites to collect hourly data.
I'll add too, real quick, that it's becoming easier and easier for sites to do that if you go to digital data logging, like any of the apps, Trek-Tellen or Dunkadoo or others that let you, that you can count on with a mobile device, your phone or a tablet. If they're set up to log those data hourly, and they can be set up to push those data straight to hop count, which means that you don't have to have, the site coordinators do that or backlog data. So it's becoming more and more easy to get data at that level. And Dave B's right. Like, if you can put that in, then any effort that RPI would want to do, or that anyone that wants to use the data that are on hot count, if they have questions that can be answered with hourly data, you got to have that hourly data in.
Yeah, it helps a lot. I think actually that was our last comment. So thank you so much, Dave, for the presentation and answering all those great questions. I think I will turn things back over to Josh so he can do a little closing here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Julie. And thank you, Dave. What a wonderful talk. It's the second time I've heard at least a version of it, especially enjoyed it at our conference this last summer. So thank you so much for doing this again, actually, because we had several folks that weren't available for our conference that were really interested in this talk. So again, HMANA really appreciates all the work you're doing, as well as all the support you give us. So thank you very much. Just in closing, just a few things. We're still working out who our speakers are going to be for February and March. We have a few things coming together, and we're just nailing down details. So please stay tuned. Just to echo what Julie said, don't forget to provide your emails to us either here in the chat, or feel free to email Julie at brown@hmana.org. It's a pretty easy one, and we'll get you added to that e-news. Speaking of news and participating sites in RPI, we do have a fast approaching HMANA tour coming up that is going to be centered in Duluth, Minnesota, with a focus on northern species coming down, especially owls. And part of that trip is going to be heavily focused on Hawk Ridge, their count site, and the surrounding areas of the ridge. So if that's something you're interested in, please see HMANA.org and the tours page, get a hold of us to register, or check us out on Facebook. With that, that's all we have for the day. Again, thank you everybody for joining us, and we'll see you in a month. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.